This is El Salvador, located in Central America, the most dangerous country in the world. So dangerous that just 8 to 9 years ago, it was called the murder capital of the world because an average of 16 to 20 people were murdered here every day. Between 2014 and 2017, the situation was so bad that about 2,000 people were killed in gang wars and 20% of the population had to flee the country. But in the last 4 years, the most dangerous country in the world has now risen to the list of the safest countries in the world, where the crime rate is now even lower than that of the United States. El Salvador is the smallest country in Central America, but geopolitically it is a very important country, and the reason for this is its location. El Salvador is in the south of Mexico, between Guatemala and Honduras, and then due to its coastline along the Pacific Ocean, it also has access to the Panama Canal. This means that if the government is destabilized here, the gangs here can also damage the Panama Canal, a huge trading choke point in the world, and that is why the United States has always had a great interest in El Salvador. The relationship between these two countries is so close that when the United States attacked Iraq in 2003, El Salvador and Latter-day Saints were the only country in the United States that joined the US coalition forces. In addition, all the airports in El Salvador can be used by the American military at any time, and most of the American military uses this airport for anti-narcotics missions. If you go to El Salvador today, you will not be able to imagine the beauty and peace there that a few years ago this country was a victim of the worst violence, and this violence is related to the history of El Salvador as well as to something that many of us drink every morning, and that is coffee. In the early 19th century, El Salvador's coffee industry was booming. At that time, El Salvador was under the control of the Spanish Empire, and the coffee industry accounted for 95% of its GDP. But a big problem was that 77% of El Salvador's agricultural land was controlled by 1% of the people, due to which income inequality was very high. The entire El Salvador was controlled by just 14 families who made all the laws for their own benefit. In 1821, El Salvador became independent from Spanish rule, but for the next several years, the same families continued to control El Salvador. Then, from 1930 to 1970, there was a military dictatorship in El Salvador, and they continued to introduce land reforms that were beneficial to these 14 families. As a result, hatred against the government began to grow among the people, and this hatred grew so much that the government, both far left and far right, a massive civil war broke out between the political wings, which lasted until 1992, killing 65,000 people. The United States continued to financially and militarily support the government of Salvador throughout this period. About 500,000 people fled El Salvador to different South American countries, and many ended up in the American city of Los Angeles, which had already become the center of gang wars at that time. These gangs began targeting the new arrivals from El Salvador. In response, the people of El Salvador came together and formed their own community, which later became known as the MS-13 gang. This community, which was formed with the aim of protecting their families, had now become a gang of hardcore criminals, which was now spreading its influence in American cities. When the Civil War ended in 1992, the United States arrested these gang members and deported them back to El Salvador. After the Civil War, El Salvador's economy and institutions were completely destroyed, and these gangs started taking advantage of this situation. The gang members who were deported and returned had contacts with criminals still in the United States, and using them, these gangs started smuggling weapons from the United States into Salvador and then using them to increase their influence in El Salvador. These gangs would extort money from businesses and shopkeepers. Anyone who refused or tried to inform the police would be killed. Between 2000 and 2011, Salvador was completely under the control of the gangs. The government was completely helpless, and there was a lot of fear among the common people. The prisons of El Salvador were full of these gang members, but still it did not make any difference. Rather, the situation was getting worse. People were even afraid to send their children to school for fear of being kidnapped. The people of El Salvador were trying to go to America legally and illegally, and seeing the flow of so many immigrants, the administration also got worried and sent a message to the Salvador government to start taking strict action against these gangs. But it seemed that the Salvador government was also afraid of these gangs. In 2015, the Salvador government passed a law in which gangs were declared a terrorist group, and even gang members who committed minor crimes were imprisoned for 60 years, but still there was no difference in the crime rate. The government also tried to negotiate with these gangs, but the soft tactics had failed. There was a lot of anger among the people against the government. In such a situation, in 2019, a young social media political activist became very popular among the people. His name was Nayib Bukele. Nayib was the mayor of San Salvador, the capital of El-Salvador. He spoke very openly about the deteriorating law and order situation in Salvador and criticized the government for taking a soft approach. According to him, the only way to bring down the crime rate in El Salvador was for the government to have a $0 policy on gangs. People liked his point of view a lot, and as a result he became the president of El Salvador in 2019 with 53% of the vote, and this is where El Salvador's transformation story begins. Bukele started working on his plan as soon as he was half in power. First, he presented a bill to borrow $19 million from the United States in the Assembly, which was rejected by the legislators. In the meantime, government forces entered the Capitol building and intimidated the legislators. Then, finally, under public pressure, the Assembly approved the loan. With the aid received from the United States, Bukele did two things. First, he built a maximum security prison for 40,000 prisoners on 410 acres. Second, he hired 38,000 police and 24,000 soldiers were gathered and a joint force was formed. This force patrolled the cities of El Salvador and arrested gang members and sent them to this 410-acre maximum security prison. The pressure on the gangs began to increase, but there was no significant difference in the crime rate. But then in March 2022, a huge gang war broke out in which almost 100 people were killed in 3 days. Bukele immediately got a special exemption bill passed by the Assembly, according to which for the next 30 days, government forces could arrest any person, search their house, and even in some cases, they were given the right to shoot to death. For 30 days, the case of any person taken into custody could not be tried in any court. In the next few months, 70,000 people were arrested. Those who tried to resist even a little were shot on the spot. By the end of 2022, El Salvador and the murder rate had dropped to 56%, and in 2023, the crime rate in El Salvador was lower than in the United States. Today, the people of El Salvador are freely roaming the markets. There is no one to threaten businesses and shopkeepers or to collect money from them. The credit for this peace goes to Vice President Bukele, whose approval rating has crossed 90% in just 2 years. Many leaders in the United States are now thinking of adopting Bukele-like policies to control the crime rate, but many analysts believe that El Salvador has had to pay a heavy price for ending the crime rate, and that price is that Bukele now has unquestionable power. The special executive law that was passed for 30 days has been extended 22 times and is still active to this day, due to which 2% of El Salvador's population is in prison and no trial has started for them yet. According to local journalists, among those arrested are many innocent people whose families do not even know which is he in jail or alive or not. This is Mijia, whose daughter has been held by the forces for a year and a half, and she still doesn't even know which prison she is in. There are thousands of other cases like this, which shows that this is proving to be very scary for many people. In 2022, Bukele's forces raided the offices of prosecutors investigating corruption charges against his government and intimidated them so much that 4 investigators fled El Salvador, leaving El Salvador behind. All these cases were suppressed. On the one hand, there is no doubt that Bukele has transformed El Salvador, but on the other hand, in this whole process, he has become so powerful that his government is no longer accountable even to the courts. But perhaps it was necessary to do all this to achieve peace. How will Bukele's unquestionable power prove to be for El Salvador in the future? Only time will tell. Do you think what happened in El Salvador is the best way to control the crime rate, or was it a very crude method that could have consequences in the coming days? Be sure to give your opinion in the comments below because we read your comments with great interest. Here are all the sources from which we have compiled this video. If you like the video, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel. See you in the next video. Take care. God bless.